Attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good evening, everybody. This is Tim Cusick from Peaks Coaching Group. I hope everybody's having a great day. You just got done with a great holiday weekend and got some good riding and racing and running and swimming and the things that you do. Really appreciate you joining us tonight for our webinar. We have Dr. Alan Lim presenting tonight. Going to take us through some exciting stuff about nutrition. I know, it's funny, we already have some questions rolling in, so I know there's always such a great interest in nutrition and hydration and, how we support our training and racing, throughout the summer and the whole season. Most of you know, I would bet you pretty much everyone knows that really, Dr. Alan Lim is with Scratch Labs. He'll give you a touch of background as he gets rolling on himself, but we've been partnered with Scratch for about 2 years now. And, at Peaks, for most of you guys, I see a lot of names we know. You know us and we know you. We are very picky about the products and what we bring in our door. We first got to test the product a couple of years ago when it came onto the market. As a matter of fact, I tested it when it was still secret, working with George Hengavi and some of his friends down at a camp in South Carolina, and was immediately impressed. When it came out as a product, we knew we wanted to work with it. We've partnered with Scratch and Alan for a couple of years here. Scratch is our exclusive drink mix. We use it, in all of our camps. It's a great way to demo it. I can't tell you how excited we were in this spring to have the cookie mix at our camp. We did a tremendous, we made a lot of happy campers with cookies. It was actually pretty funny. We did a lot of baking and a lot of cookie eating, a fantastic product. So, it really is great when such a great partner not only partners with us in the product level, but steps in and really wants to help with just supporting, the endurance sports through education. And, I know Alan is really somebody who gives back to the endurance sport world. He spends a lot of time educating and helping. So I have a real feeling that Scratch Labs, the way Alan approaches it, it's not a business. This is something that he really is out there just trying to help people perform better, learn more. So what I'm going to do is, throughout today's presentation, I just want to show you one quick slide here. You can ask questions. This is a little question box. It can be opened by this little arrow, left and right. It should be on the right-hand side of your screen for most of you. If you open it, you'll notice one of the options is questions. If you type a question here, it will show up on my screen. At select points, I will facilitate questions. We're going to you're all on mute, so unfortunately you don't have the ability to talk, but if you type in your question, I will work with Alan at certain points and I'll pick some of the best questions to be asked. We might not get to all of them, but oftentimes we do answer all of them. What we tend to see is you'll get 5 or 6 or 7 of the same type of questions and one answer answers them all. So feel free to answer your questions as you go. We'll answer them as we get to it and go from there. So, what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to make Alan the presenter. So Alan, you should see a little box come up and say, show my screen, which we now can see your screen, and you are ready to roll.
All right. Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. I'll make one little disclaimer here that this is the first webinar that I've ever done. So I find it a little bizarre that I'm just kind of talking into my screen right now, but I'll do my best, and hopefully you guys will have a good time, learn some stuff, and have some great questions at the end. So today I'm going to talk mostly about hydration for endurance athletes, a little bit of nutrition. It's kind of hard to stack both of these topics in, so I found myself kind of gravitating more towards talking about hydration, but the food component is certainly really important. Today we're basically going to go over a couple of things. I'm going to start out by talking about this distinction that I try to make when I'm talking about performance, whether we're talking about hydration or we're talking about nutrition. It's this idea of bottlenecks versus marginal gains. Then we'll shift a bit and talk about hydration itself. We'll talk about hydration as a way to maintain your total body water and what that means and how we store water in our bodies, where it all goes, and what it's all for. The big what it's for is really about thermoregulation and heat load. So we'll talk a little bit about thermoregulation. It's difficult to talk about hydration without actually talking about why we hydrate. So the physiological consequences of thermoregulation and some of the performance consequences of heat load will be discussed. Then obviously we'll talk about replacing sweat. We'll spend a bit of time specifically focused on sweat sodium and topics related to the absorption of fluid. We'll spend some time about replacing fuel and that kind of balance between, hydration versus actual fuel needs, some problems with sports drinks, and then finally we'll end with some practical solutions. All right, so when we think about performance, we often think about the winning margin, and the winning margin in most competitive events can be very, very, very small. People talk about winning by literally, a pixel, right? But the winning margin, as it translates to sports science, is often discussed as the marginal gain. And so we end up spending, I think, a lot of time, or maybe too much time, talking about all the little tiny details that we have to pay attention to because the winning margin can be so small. But what I learned, very early in my career was that it wasn't about the marginal gain. It was really about the bottleneck. And the bottleneck is super important because, when you talk about performance, when you talk about hydration, you talk about nutrition, you talk about training systems, you talk about aerodynamics, you talk about anything related to performance, there's always going to be some bottleneck in the system. And unless you deal with that bottleneck, any amount of marginal gain that you apply doesn't really matter if it's downstream from that bottleneck. And for me as a practitioner, one of the big epiphanies or realizations was that life in and of itself was really the big bottleneck. I found myself, starting as an academic, as a sports physiologist working at the Applied Exercise Science Laboratory at the University of Colorado at Boulder, working on tools like the Power Tap to try to help athletes perform better. And when I went into the pro cycling world, I realized that a lot of my academic knowledge really didn't help, and it really didn't matter because ultimately these bottlenecks got in the way. And that, for the most part, I found myself working with really young kids who were extremely talented, but they didn't have any of the basic life skills to take care of themselves. And so, I found myself coming into the sport of cycling professionally as an academic, but really evolving into, more or less a glorified home economics instructor. But for me, that was just fine because it allowed me to help athletes take care of the different bottlenecks. Ultimately, to break it down, or at least break down my philosophy as we start talking about hydration with respect to performance, my sense of it is that performance sits on a three-legged stool. That there are really only three components that you have to worry about. You've got to worry about your work, your training and competitive schedule. You've got to worry about your recovery, which is, largely your rest and your sleep. And then you have to worry about your nutrition, what you eat and what you drink. Any one of these legs fall off and your whole stool falls apart. The problem is that it's different for every single individual, that only one person can sit on the stool at one time. And so when we think about science, we often think of, how large the study was. We think about the generalizability of a study. We think about how many participants actually participated. But when we're trying to apply the science, the reality is that the only person that matters is yourself. Ultimately N equals 1. And it's kind of a profound idea because when you read the scientific literature and you think about any of the topics we're about to discuss, you often see this huge amount of variability in the data set. And if you're someone who is an outlier who sits above or below the average data, well, knowing what the average is doesn't really help. So the way I see it, science isn't necessarily a belief system or a set of facts. It's a process for solving problems. And so as I discuss these topics today, realize that I'm not so much trying to detail out a bunch of facts as much as I'm trying to help all of you understand how you can create a process for solving your own problems. With that in mind, let's talk about hydration, and let's talk about the problem that I faced when I was early in my career on the Pro Tour. The problem that I faced was a lot of whining, a lot of complaining, and a lot of moaning. These were the bottlenecks that I often faced when it came to hydration, when it came to fueling. Essentially, athletes always complaining that they can't eat or drink enough to stay hydrated or fuel without a significant amount of GI distress. And for the most part, the end result was an athlete puking over my brand new shoes. This was the problem that I was dealing with early in my career, and essentially the problem that formed the basis for everything that we now do at Scratch Labs, whether it be, our, kind of push for real food in terms of fueling, or whether it be our sports drink. With that in mind, I think that the big kind of bottleneck when it comes to nutrition and hydration is this simple question. Is the bottleneck water or is it fuel? Another way that you can think of this question is, am I sweating more than I'm burning calories, or am I burning calories more than I'm sweating? Which is more important? Is it more important for me to be hydrating and not necessarily worrying about my fuel, or do I need to be worrying more about fuel and not so much about hydration? I'll answer that in a very simple way. I think that for the most part, what I tend to see, or the problem set that I often see, is that most people overeat and underdrink. And in the same way that we can survive, say, for weeks without food, but only days without water, performance ultimately is very much the same. Our performance tends to fall apart much more readily when we become dehydrated than it does when we're not intaking enough calories. And that's primarily because we store a lot of extra fuel in our bodies in the form of stored glycogen or fat or even protein. That being said, whether or not the bottleneck is water or fuel really depends on a lot of different factors. It depends on the environment, first and foremost, what the temperature is, the humidity, the altitude, the amount of radiation, how much airflow you might be experiencing. It depends on the intensity and the duration, which ultimately dictate how many calories you're burning or your energy expenditure. That also has a profound effect on how much heat you generate, which is another big problem. And it also finally depends on the person, right? How metabolically efficient are you? How much surface area do you have? How heavy are you? How much fuel do you already have on board? How much water do you have on board? These variables are so complex that there really isn't a simple answer to this. But generally speaking, I think that our senses are pretty good. And that if we're thirsty, we need to drink, and if we're hungry, we need to eat. And for the most part, in the summertime, when it's hot, obviously the priority shifts towards hydration, and in the wintertime, when it's a lot cooler, the priority shifts towards fuel. So let's spend some time talking about hydration. Ultimately, hydration is all about maintaining our total body water. And our total body water is really dependent upon our fat-free mass. Ultimately, lean tissue holds more water. So for the most part, we're about 55 to 70% total water, depending upon how lean we are. That water, which is the majority of our body, sits in three basic compartments. It sits in side cells, which is the intracellular space. It sits between cells, so that's the extracellular space. And that extracellular space can be divided into the space between cells and the space within blood vessels. So your vascular space, which is your plasma volume, and your interstitial space, which is the space between the cells and those blood vessels. Ultimately, water shifts between these spaces according to the changes in electrolytes, the changes in basically sodium, potassium within our body between each space. The primary objective here is that we ultimately want to maintain our blood pressure at all times, whether it be during exercise or whether we're just sitting here. And that means that our body is constantly working to preserve the plasma or intravascular space, right? We're constantly regulating the pressure inside of our blood vessels so that we have blood going to our brain so that we can, provide oxygen to working muscles and organs. So ultimately, our body water balance is dependent upon a few things. It's dependent upon the fluid that we intake into our bodies, which go into our plasma, right? That can exchange via our capillaries with the fluid between our cells, and then through osmotic exchange, that can also exchange between the fluid inside of our cells. Fluid output is regulated by our kidneys, by how much we might sweat, by the vapor coming through our lungs, and what comes out through our GI tract in terms of feces. One thing to know or to recognize here is that when we look at the water content inside of our bloodstreams, inside of our plasma or intravascular space, that water has an electrolyte content, and that electrolyte content is primarily sodium. But if we look at the electrolyte content inside our intracellular fluid, that electrolyte tends to be mostly potassium. So we tend to try to keep this balance between sodium and potassium in our bodies, where we, sequester potassium within cells, and we tend to leave sodium outside of cells. So for the most part, when we're regulating fluid output, we're not just regulating that water level, but we're, for the most part, regulating that sodium balance, either through our kidneys or through our skin. One thing to note is that if our sodium balance is too high, our kidneys tend to filtrate out that extra sodium. If it's too low, our kidneys tend to hold on to that extra sodium. With respect to sweat, sweat loses mostly sodium. We don't tend to lose a lot of potassium or other electrolytes. We tend to lose mostly sodium because that's what we see in our plasma. But we'll get a little more to that in just a bit. Ultimately, with respect to exercise and measuring this hydration status, there's not really a good gold standard right now. If you're not thirsty and you're at a consistent body weight is ultimately the best measure of this total body water, because it's the one variable besides our fuel storage that changes most readily during exercise. So in terms of measuring this hydration or status, usually the best thing to do is to measure your body weight before and after exercise. That difference in weight is going to be primarily your hydration loss or your water loss. You can also measure something called urine-specific gravity, which is essentially how concentrated your urine is. And if your urine is very, very concentrated, that might be a sign that you're underhydrated. You can buy these little specific gravity sticks, are essentially these pee sticks from places like Amazon. You can also measure the blood osmolarity. We'll talk about osmolarity quite a bit in this lecture, but osmolarity is essentially the molecular concentration of a solution or a fluid. So if you're dehydrated, you'll have a higher osmolarity or higher molecular concentration of plasma. Some people are working on skin measures, looking at the flexibility of skin, looking at different skin measures that might indicate hydration. Finally, a last measure might be constipation. All things being equal, however, it's really that change in body weight during exercise that reflects our total body water loss. And during exercise, what's essentially happening is that as we sweat and are losing fluid out of our plasma space, we're replacing that plasma with fluid from inside our cells and between our cells. We can do this for quite some time until we lose so much fluid inside of our cells or between our cells that cellular function actually drops off, and that's when we get some real performance declines. Ultimately, here's the reason why we sweat, and the kind of the big reason for hydration. And the big reason is heat load. You take a kid like Taylor Finney, who can produce about 400 watts for 1 hour, who is pretty efficient at about 25% gross mechanical efficiency, meaning that 25% of everything that he burns as fuel or energy actually gets translated to the bike, which is, doesn't sound great, but is actually pretty good. What this means is, for a kid like Taylor to hold 400 watts for an hour, he actually needs to produce or burn 1,600 watts of energy. Of that 1,600 watts, 1,200 watts is wasted as heat, and only 400 watts actually goes to the bicycle. So during very, very intense exercise, we have this big heat load problem. 1,200 watts of heat inside a biological machine is a really difficult thing to deal with. Imagine literally swallowing a toaster oven a 1200-watt toaster oven and turning that on and having your body cope or deal with it. So one of the primary responses to heat is that we find a way to cope with it by redistributing blood flow. What happens during exercise is as we get hot, because we're not that efficient, we spend or send more blood to skin. This is called a cutaneous vasodilation. Essentially what happens is blood vessels in your skin dilate or open up so that you can actually dissipate that heat out into the environment. This causes something called a relative hypovolemia. A relative hypovolemia is basically a drop in blood pressure or a drop in your relative blood volume, despite the fact that there's no loss in fluid because your vascular space is expanding to try to release this extra heat load. So a relative hypovolemia is increasing the vascular space due to a peripheral vasodilation. This puts a huge amount of load on the cardiovascular system, right? Essentially, we're having to increase our heart rate. We're having to increase the amount of blood that we push through our cardiovascular system because the piping or the network of blood vessels has expanded to try to release heat. The next thing that happens is we obviously sweat. We lose water and electrolytes through sweat in an attempt to cool the skin via evaporation so that that hot fluid that is now moving out towards the skin can actually cool off due to the cooling effect of sweat or evaporation. You know, sweat rates can vary significantly depending upon your body size and shape. For some elite endurance athletes in very, very hot conditions, sweat rates can be as high as 4 liters per hour. On average, people, you know, during moderate intensity exercise will lose anywhere from 1 to 2 liters per hour. This is ultimately dependent upon how hard you're going, your body size and shape, and how hot it is. You know, for most people, it's really, really important not to try to guess this number, but to actually weigh yourself before and after exercise so that you can look at your total sweat loss and see relative to what you've actually had to drink if you've been drinking enough. Some of the implications of this heat load and this peripheral vasodilation and this sweat. First, this heat load creates a competition for blood to deliver oxygen and to remove heat. So now you're not only moving blood so that you can deliver oxygen, but you're also moving blood so that you can remove heat. And the more heat load that you have, the less efficient you are at removing that heat, the more blood you're going to have to essentially pump to remove that heat. And so what ends up happening is there's this competition of delivering oxygen versus removing heat. The more blood volume we lose through sweat and the more blood that gets redistributed to the skin to cool, the less we ultimately have for working muscle. And so ultimately, hydrating during exercise is super important because as we lose that volume through sweat, it puts this huge strain on our cardiovascular system. And if we don't replace that fluid, we don't have enough blood to deliver oxygen to working muscle. This heat load ultimately, as I said, increases the cardiovascular strain, and so you'll see this as a rise in heart rate, you know, at the same intensity of exercise, and as we become more and more dehydrated, this cardiovascular strain actually becomes worse. To illustrate this, you know, I've got this little slide here from Jose Gonzalez Alonso. This is a study just looking at the changes in body temperature with dehydration. The important thing to kind of focus on here is the fact that as we become more and more dehydrated, it becomes harder and harder for us to maintain a constant or consistent core temperature. This is super important because the bottleneck in terms of performance, if we get too hot, is that heat itself. And our brains, our nervous systems don't actually function when our core temperature gets too high. For the most part, once we cross about 39 degrees Celsius in temperature, and athletes reach around, you know, anywhere from 39 to 39 and a half degrees Celsius, well, we start to shut down, even if we have plenty of fuel or, you know, no matter what is going on, if we get too hot, we start to shut down and our performance drops or we stop performing. And the more dehydrated we are, the more likely it is that we're going to increase that core temperature with exercise. You can also see that as we become more and more dehydrated in this next slide, that there's a whole network of cardiovascular strain. Our blood pressure, drops, our cardiac output suffers, our heart rate increases, the amount of blood that we can essentially pump goes down. So dehydration has some profound effects not only on our core temperature, but on our cardiovascular performance. The implications of this with respect to performance are pretty profound. There are plenty of studies out there that show that even with a very small amount of dehydration, measured as a % of body weight loss, that a drop as little as 2% can impair aerobic performance in warm or hot environments. That these performance declines are heightened by an increase in your core temperature and your skin temperature. So as we become dehydrated, the performance decrements are greater as our core temp increases and as our skin temp increases. This dehydration can also have profound effects on our cognitive function. In fact, as we dehydrate and we start to pull fluid out of the inside of our cells and between our cells to maintain our blood pressure, our brain can literally shrink, and this can have a profound impact on our ability to think and handle coordinated activities. There's a lot of controversy about how much performance decreases with a certain amount of dehydration. And certainly elite athletes who are much leaner and have a much larger storage of body water can handle a much larger decrease in their dehydration before they drop their performance. Ultimately, I'm not necessarily here to argue that there's a performance decline with dehydration, but to let people be really, really aware that this can happen, and that to pay attention to yourself and to pay attention to how much you're actually drinking, what the weight loss changes are, before and after your training and during your race events, so that you can judge this for yourself. Ultimately, the performance declines are pretty hard to measure, because in an actual race event or in an actual training event, there's so many other things that are going on that ultimately performance is so multifactorial. And in scientific studies, performance is difficult to measure, and oftentimes the way performance is measured, whether it's time to exhaustion or the absolute power or speed, can have an influence on that performance. That all being said, judge for yourself. One interesting problem that I would face when I was working with pro athletes with respect to hydration is a lot of them actually wanted to dehydrate because they felt that if they lost body weight during an activity, that their power to weight would actually improve. And this was kind of a funny notion. It's kind of like a helicopter. If you put too much fuel on it, it doesn't actually lift. It doesn't actually fly because it's too heavy. And a lot of elite athletes that I've worked with and talked to, have this perception that they want to be as light as possible, and that if they can get to the base of a climb and they're somewhat dehydrated, that their performance will actually be better because they're lighter. There's a really great study done out of Australia looking at this exact question, looking at the influence of hydration status on thermoregulation and cycling during a hill climb. And essentially the scenario they set up was to have athletes dehydrate over the course of a long ride, and then measure their hill climb performance when they were dehydrated versus when they were properly hydrated. Long story short, the results show that performance time actually improved when these athletes were normally hydrated and not dehydrated while climbing. So that despite drop in body weight and the potential for an increase in power to weight, their power to weight was actually hurt by not taking on extra fluids. We'll bypass this for a little bit and move on to sweat. Ultimately, when we sweat, we lose water and we also lose electrolytes. About 90% of that is basic table salt, sodium chloride. Only about 5, 3, and 2% are potassium, calcium, and magnesium. And this really ultimately reflects the electrolytes that we have in our bloodstream. Of these electrolytes, sodium, chloride, potassium, calcium, magnesium, it's really only sodium that is critical in terms of our need to replace. If we don't replace potassium, if we don't replace calcium, if we don't replace magnesium, if we don't replace chloride ion during exercise, there aren't typically too many negative effects, at least acutely during that activity. But if we don't replace that sodium, right, and we only drink water during exercise, there can be some pretty devastating consequences. Because of that, it's become really, really important, at least for me and for the work that I do, to measure individual sweat sodium. What I discovered in working with athletes was that there was a real discrepancy in terms of the individual variation in sweat sodium loss. Some athletes were as low as 200 milligrams per liter of sweat. Other athletes were as high as 2,000 milligrams per liter of sweat. And we discovered this using a system called the Macrodet sweat collector. This is a pretty unique sweat collection system that was initially developed to diagnose cystic fibrosis in little babies. One of the very interesting things about cystic fibrosis is that patients with cystic fibrosis lose all of the sodium in their bloodstream through their sweat. Normally when we sweat, our sweat gland is able to spare or resequester a bunch of the sodium that is being pumped through it so that we don't lose all the sodium in our blood. Typical saline or blood has about 3,500 milligrams of sodium in a liter of blood. A cystic fibrosis patient will lose all 3,500 milligrams. Somebody who has a great ability to resequester that sodium back might only lose 200 or 300 milligrams. On average, people lose about 1,000 milligrams of sodium. Doing a sweat collection, however, is really, really difficult because as soon as you sweat, that sweat evaporates to try to cool us off. So the Macrodet system is really clever because what it does is it actually is a little plastic collection unit that forms an airtight seal against the skin. There's a small little capillary tube that is embedded through a small hole in the middle of it, and as you sweat, that capillary tube captures the sweat without allowing any of that sweat to be evaporated. We can then take that sample and push it through a sodium sweat analyzer and measure individual sweat sodium rates. As I said earlier, sweat sodium is highly variable across the population, and sodium is really the only electrolyte that we have to replace in order to maintain performance. As low as 200 milligrams per liter of sweat, as high as 2,000 milligrams per liter of sweat. But it's ultimately lower than what we find in blood, which is 3,500 milligrams per liter. The variability in this sweat sodium is primarily affected by genetics. If you look at the sweat or the salt trade, and you look at how populations evolved around the salt trade, you start to see these patterns where people who grew up in areas where salt was not plentiful, if they lost too much salt in their sweat, they wouldn't actually survive. And so there's this really interesting effect of natural selection on this sodium sweat variability. That being said, the sweat sodium can also be affected by your sweat rate, by your dietary sodium intake, by utilization, and by, to some extent, your gender. Generally speaking, the faster we sweat, the more sodium we lose because that sweat is moving through the sweat gland so fast that there's not as much time to resequester that sodium. Dietary sodium intake can have a small effect if that raises your blood sodium levels. You'll essentially be introducing more sodium to that sweat gland. Heat acclimatization can also have an effect. As we become more acclimatized to the heat, we actually do a better job of resequestering sodium. So we lose less sodium, our sweat becomes more dilute. And for the most part, in terms of the data set that we have, we tend to see that women compared to men tend to be slightly less salty than men. That being said, the individual variation between each gender, between either women or between men is much greater than the variation that we find between genders. So it's a very small effect. Ultimately, my sense of it is that genetics probably determines about 80–85% of the sodium that we lose in our sweat, and these other factors like your sweat rate, your dietary sodium intake, and your heat optimization and or gender affect the rest of it. For us, this became a real problem working with a professional cycling team and giving athletes the right solution to drink. We couldn't, at least on a pro cycling team, have, in a grand tour like the Tour de France, have 9 different sports drinks for the 9 different athletes. And so what we ended up in terms of with the solution was making only 3 types of drinks. On a typical race day, what we'll do is we'll give the athletes 3 choices. They can either drink water, they can either drink a sports drink, or they can drink something that is saline. Water is kind of a no-brainer, right? You have the Swannies fill bottles with water. The sports drink we gave them obviously was Scratch, what then was our secret drink mix. That has about 720 milligrams of sodium per liter, which is about average for the pro tour population. The general population is typically a little higher at about 900 to 1,000 milligrams. And then finally, we developed this drink called the hyperhydration drink, which was essentially just a saline drink. It's 3,500 milligrams of sodium per liter from sodium citrate. So what happened is that, for example, if an athlete knew that their sweat sodium was low, 480 milligrams, they would drink some combination of water to sports drink, and they would know that, for example, at 480 milligrams, the ratio of sports drink that they needed was 2 sports drinks for every 1 water, or 1 water for every 2 bottles of sports drink. And that's all they really had to remember. For every 2 bottles of mix I have, I need 1 bottle of water. If somebody was on the very high side, say 1,000 milligrams of sweat sodium for that population, they knew that for every 6 bottles of mix they drank, they had to have 1 bottle of our hyperhydration or saline drink. And ultimately, what we had athletes focus on was maintaining or having their own ratio of these 3 different drink options so that they could get the right amount of sodium back in their bodies for these very long endurance events. That all being said, it's important to realize that the body is pretty resilient, and that for shorter term activity, even in the heat, even at high sweat rates, we do store a large amount of sodium and fluid in the body such that, even if we just drank water, we'd probably be fine. It's really only when we get to these very, very long events where there's a big strain on our fluid balance and our sodium balance that measuring the sweat sodium concentration and getting athletes the right concentration of fluid really, really matters. So if you're somebody who is a very, very salty sweater, or you know that because you see a lot of extra salt on your jersey compared to other people because you crave more sodium than your peers because you have a tendency to have problems with hydration or with cramping, then getting a sweat sodium test and paying more attention to this can be really, really valuable. That being said, for the most part, people do pretty fine just listening to themselves. Besides the electrolyte or sodium that we are losing in our sweat, obviously we're also losing water. So a little bit on how that water moves from our mouth into our stomachs through our intestines. Ultimately, water transport across the small intestine can happen in 2 ways. It can either happen passively or it can be facilitated. The passive movement of water across the small intestine is referred to as osmosis. And osmosis occurs when there is a higher concentration across a semi-permeable membrane, in this case the small intestine, than there is on the other side. So if we're just drinking water, there's a natural drive for that water to want to dilute out our blood, and so water moves towards blood. But if we end up drinking something that has a higher concentration than our blood, water will tend to move the other way. It'll tend to move from inside our bloodstream or body into our intestinal lumen or our gut. Ultimately, the molecular concentration of a drink can be measured as the osmolarity of a drink. It's the measure of the total concentration, and that concentration of drink or of solution inside of a drink can be broken up into what are termed non-penetrating or penetrating molecules. Essentially, penetrating molecules are molecules that your small intestine actually recognize and can be pulled across the small intestine. Sugar, for example, is a penetrating molecule, and as your body pulls sugar across the small intestine, it changes the concentration across the membrane, and that, in effect, also pulls water across. On the other hand, if you have something that isn't penetrating, like a food coloring or excess chemicals that aren't recognized by the gut, as those molecules accumulate inside the intestinal lumen, they can start to act as laxatives as water moves the other way. Ultimately, the tonicity, which you might often hear drinks described as hypertonic or isotonic or hypotonic, is a measure of the non-penetrating solutes. It's a measure of how many molecules in a solution can't actually be transported across the small intestine. That's super important because if these molecules don't get across the small intestine, unless that solution is a very low concentration, water won't get across as well. Besides water movement via osmosis, water can also move across the small intestine, facilitated through the transport of sodium and glucose. This is basically the basis of most oral rehydration solutions. If you add a bunch of sodium and a little bit of sugar to a drink mix, you can pull a lot of water across the small intestine. Essentially, for every 2 molecules of sodium and 1 molecule of glucose that you pull across the small intestine, you can open up a channel that pulls across about 210 molecules of water. So when we're talking about hydrating athletes, we're really talking about optimizing water absorption either by osmosis, by having a low osmotic pressure drink, one that sits below blood, which is at 280. We're also talking about having a drink with low tonicity, so a drink that has a very low number of non-penetrating particles. So for example, if we take a drink like Coke, Coke has a very, very high osmotic pressure. It's about 720 milliosmoles. The fortunate thing is that the majority of those molecules are penetrating. 450 can actually move across the small intestine, which can help pull water across as well. You take something like magnesium citrate, which is typically used as a laxative, however, and even at a very small amount of that particular compound, you can create a situation where you end up pulling water into the lumen and causing a laxative effect. Besides osmosis or having a low osmotic pressure and a low tonicity, we also want a little bit of glucose and enough sodium so that we can help facilitate some water transport via that glucose and sodium mechanism. The transport of carbohydrates is also very important to this whole equation. Sugars can cross the small intestine and enter the body as simple single sugars, either as glucose, fructose, or as milk sugar, galactose. A lot of people tend to have problems with milk sugar, and so for the most part, we're really talking about 2 different types of transporters, a glucose transporter and a fructose transporter. The importance here is that the faster that we can transport molecules across the small intestine, the faster we can not only get fuel, but the faster we can actually move water across as well. And so having 2 transporters or 2 types of sugars in a drink is super important in terms of minimizing GI distress, maximizing the absorption of fuel, and helping the movement of water. In the work that we've done, we found that the ratio of glucose to fructose transporters is slightly in favor of glucose. And so we designed our drink mix and our food products to have slightly more glucose than fructose so that we can optimize these 2 channels for getting simple sugars back into the body. One thing to consider about nutrition and hydration as a whole is this whole process of digestion. which really begins when we begin chewing food. And that I think that most people get into problems with GI distress when they end up consuming too much simple sugar at once that is already pre-digested or in a semi-fluid state that ends up emptying from the stomach faster than the intestines can absorb. So one thing to recognize is that after we chew food or drink fluid, that food or fluid first goes into our stomach. The stomach is essentially a big reservoir for food and fluid, and it's got a little sphincter at the end of it that then controls the pacing of that food and fluid into the small intestine. It's ultimately at the small intestine where food and fluid is ultimately absorbed. With a lot of semi-liquid energy sources or very, very highly concentrated carbohydrate solutions, what ends up happening is since you don't have to digest the food, it empties from the stomach at a very high rate, and that's called the gastric emptying rate. And if you get a gastric emptying rate that is faster than the ability for the small intestine to absorb that food or fluid, that's when you start to get some problems with GI distress. I'm not necessarily saying that drinking highly concentrated carbohydrates or semi-solids is a bad thing. What I'm saying is that if you take too much of it at once, you can end up having some problems. So if you do use a highly concentrated carbohydrate solution or a semi-solid, it's important to pace the entrance yourself externally. One of the benefits that I found with real food is that if you actually have to digest something, you can essentially use your stomach as a reservoir for food, and you essentially turn the stomach into a glucose strip, and you end up not having to think about it as much. Ultimately, if you're going to take in a lot of simple sugars externally, you need to mind the pacing of that and make sure that you don't empty that stuff from your stomach at a faster rate than your intestines can absorb, or you'll have some problems. A lot of these problems were essentially the problems that I found with a lot of commercially available sports drinks when I was working on the Pro Tour. Found a lot of problems with bloating and diarrhea. We found a lot of problems with guys needing to urinate despite the fact that they were dehydrating. We had problems with, obviously, dehydration and subpar performance. And a lot of this was ultimately with respect to sports drinks and hydration due to the fact that there was just simply too much carbohydrate in the solutions. There was too much of one type of carbohydrate. Either they were too glucose heavy or they were too fructose heavy. There wasn't enough salt to help replace the sodium that athletes were losing, and in turn this caused the excess urination as we diluted out the blood sodium levels by drinking too much water. We were getting problems with taste and athletes becoming tired of flavor. A lot of commercially available sports drinks had a lot of excess food additives, a lot of extra ingredients that weren't penetrating the small intestines. So what we essentially did to improve the sports or sweat drinks was realize that they're really there not necessarily to be used as fuel, but to be there to replace sweat. So we minimize the total ingredients to significantly decrease the osmolarity. We decrease the synthetic ingredients to decrease the tonicity. We use a combination of fructose and glucose in favor of glucose. And we ended up at about a 4% carbohydrate solution, about 4 grams per 100 mils. We found this to be really, really well tolerated in a lot of different conditions. And we found that in very, very hot situations, that if athletes drank enough so that they didn't dehydrate more than about 3%, they could actually drink most of their calories, even though the drink that we used was actually a very low concentration. In effect, by having a lower concentration drink mix, we found that we could supply more energy to athletes because they could actually drink more without having a bad gut. And then finally, we realized that there was a lot of variability in sodium loss, and so aside from actually measuring that, we ended up making 2 types of sports drinks, one that was at kind of the average for the population, and this hyperhydration solution, which is a ceiling drink, so that athletes could either titrate between water and sports drink, between the sports drink and this saline solution. A couple of solutions ultimately that we recommend is find a way to drink something so that you don't lose more than about 3% of your body weight. In my experience, at least anecdotally in the field, once athletes lost about 3 to 4% body weight, their performance actually started to really decline. We found that on average, we need to replace 700 to 800 milligrams of sodium, and that we couldn't just use regular table salt. We ended up using sodium citrate because it's a lot easier on the stomach. Sodium citrate is essentially sodium bound to deacidified fruit acid. And then, we ended up titrating extra saline or water depending upon individual loss. That being said, the body's pretty resilient, and for the most part, even with our high sodium sweat loss individuals, we could make up for a lot of loss after exercise by increasing dietary sodium. 4% solution works pretty well. We use freeze-dried fruit to flavor, and we try to avoid colors, emulsifiers, flavor agents, any type of artificial sweeteners. One other kind of solution that we found works really well is to prehydrate athletes before they come into an event. And essentially, what we would do is to ensure that athletes were maximally hydrated, we would give them 1 to 1.5 liters of a saline-like solution, our hyperhydration, immediately before exercise or the night before. The benefit of this is that since it's the same concentration as blood, they would tend to hold on to it. And if they didn't need that fluid, they would just urinate that fluid. The other benefit of prehydrating is that when you go out into the heat and you get that cutaneous vasodilation, you get that relative hypovolemia, which is that increase in, a net kind of blood volume or blood loss because your vessels are vasodilating. By replacing that with extra fluid right before you start exercising, you can actually offset that decrease in blood pressure when you go out into the heat. Have you ever had that feeling when you go out into the heat where all of a sudden you feel those blood vessels dilating and you feel really, really poor all of a sudden? That's that relative hypovolemia. And so drinking a bunch right before you get exposed to the heat or right before you're about to exercise can actually help quite a bit. Obviously, all of this really kind of comes down to staying cool as well. That besides hydrating so that you have ample fluid to sweat, you can also just find ways to stay cool, right? What we ended up doing was filling up little pantyhose with ice, creating these little ice socks that athletes could use to put down their jersey and cool themselves real time. And this helped decrease the amount of fluid that they actually needed to drink. One really important thing about this, however, is that you want your cooling effect to not constrict your blood vessels. We found with a lot of different ice or ice vest systems that if we use them for too long, they could actually cause the blood vessels in the skin to clamp down because of that cold, and that would actually shunt more hot blood to the core, which would have the opposite effect. So, it doesn't have to be that complicated. You can simply dunk a towel in ice water, for example, and either pre-cool or cool someone off so that they improve their thermoregulation and offset the need for hydration. With that in mind, it's also important to focus on drinking very, very cold solutions because those cold solutions can also improve thermoregulation. And ultimately, hydration, in my mind, is not just about replacing sweat, but it's about giving your body everything it can have so that it can stay cool. With that in mind, especially as we come into the summer months, it's super important to realize that heat acclimatization in and of itself can go a long way to helping prepare athletes for the summer. Consistent exposure to high temps can significantly improve performance in the heat, primarily because we increase the amount of water that we hold both in our plasma as well as in our inside of our cells. So we increase our total body water and we increase our plasma volume. There's some work that also shows that heat acclimatization can also increase our red blood cell mass. We also improve the rate at which we sweat. We sweat more, we sweat earlier, and our sweat tends to be more dilute. So there are a host of mechanisms that can occur by adapting to the heat that change what we need in terms of hydration during the summer months. And that heat acclimatization, especially if you're going to be exercising in the heat, is a super important strategy. With respect to food, ultimately what I found, at least with the athletes I've worked with, is that most of these athletes could tolerate a lot of different types of foods and a lot of different types of prepackaged foods. But when we focus too much on giving them semi-solid prepackaged, gels or super sugary products, that they ended up having problems. They had problems because they tended to have a habit of trying to stuff their mouths with a lot of food at once. And when that happened, they would overwhelm their intestine and got rot. So what we found is that if we supplemented with as much real food as possible and did not take digestion out of the equation, we could turn that stomach into a reservoir for extra food, and the body would typically take care of itself. Ultimately, we found that in the heat, just using a 4% carbohydrate solution, if athletes had enough access to fluid, was enough. And that foods with higher moisture content ultimately work better than a lot of dry foods. In summary, if you're thirsty because of heavy sweating and heat, drink something that's not too sweet and kind of salty, that you actually like drinking, that you'll actually drink. And I know that kind of sounds pretty simple, but long story short, our body is really, really good at self-regulating, at using thirst as a mechanism for rehydrating ourselves and using our sense of taste for gauging how much sodium we need. And finally, if you're hungry, eat something as well, and have something on the solid side that will fill your stomach first and your intestines second, so that you can actually have a bit of a reservoir so that you don't overwhelm your gut. That's about all I have. Sorry if that was a little strange because I've just been talking in a screen by myself this whole time, but we'll open it up for questions and try to clear up any confusion or anything that I've talked about.
Well, first off, you did a fantastic job for your first webinar. You were like a seasoned pro. That was very well done, and thank you for such great information. Everything was perfect. It's kind of funny for everybody out there. It is hard to talk to your computer screen that long and explain it. So very well explained, very well done. We certainly have gotten some good questions. Some have been handling kind of on the private side, and some have been on the public. So you should be able to see these, everybody, in your question box. What I'm going to do is ask a couple directly, kind of facilitate the process. So if you have more questions, please add them now. I'm going to pick a couple in here that kind of seem interesting. So let's start with this. Here's an interesting one. Is there a difference in hydration and nutrition needs for the beginning of a training cycle and the end of a training cycle? If so,
Yeah,
what are
sure.
they?
Yeah, I think that what you find at the beginning of a training cycle is that we tend to need a little more food and fluid relative to our energy expenditure. And the main reason for that is that when we first start a training cycle, we don't tend to be very efficient with respect to preserving our fluid balance, preserving sodium, and or even our gross mechanical efficiency. So we tend not to be very, very efficient at the beginning of a training cycle. That means for every 100 calories that we burn, we might be only converting 20 or so calories into real work. As we get fitter, we start to improve, and we might say, convert 25, 26 of those calories. So what I tend to find is that as athletes get really, really fit, for a given amount of energy that they burn, we don't necessarily need to feed them as much, which is actually a pretty positive adaptation. At the same time, we also find that as you become more heat acclimatized, and that usually happens when you become fitter. You hold on to more fluid, you spare sodium, and you know, ultimately you might be able to get away with not worrying about drinking as much because you have more on reserve. That being said, as you become fitter and you're at the end of your training cycle, you're probably also doing more absolute work. You're probably expending more absolute energy. You're probably going much harder, and you're actually probably sweating a lot more. And so even though your relative needs may have decreased, your absolute needs have probably gone up significantly. And so you've always got to be making adjustments. You always need to be listening to your body, and you need to realize that the program that you start with at the beginning of a season isn't necessarily going to be the same as what you end when you're in peak fitness towards the end of the season.
Excellent answer. That actually leads me into another question that was here, so I'll just kind of pick up on this, which is a little same type of question, maybe a little broader. The question is, what strategies do you recommend to balancing eating enough for recovery without going over? I tend to gain weight and body fat throughout the cycling racing season.
Yeah, so that's kind of connects to the question earlier, and it's this idea that, as we become fit through the cycling season, we become more efficient. This was something that we saw a lot with some of our best pro athletes in even races like the Tour de France. We'd find that if left to their own devices and if they ate the same as they did at the beginning of the tour, they might actually gain weight, despite the fact that the demands of this event were so huge. What essentially happens is that as you become more fit through the season, your body becomes more efficient and you require less calories. So it's super important to listen to the same types of cues that you have early on in the season as you do late in the season. And those cues ultimately are thirst and hunger, right? And if you're wanting to maintain your body weight or lose body weight through the season, you're going to have to deal with going to bed a little bit hungry every night, which is kind of a bummer at times. But as we become more fit, watch what you eat, because you can put on extra weight. And knowing that for yourself, the person who asked this question, is super insightful, because ultimately that's an individual response that others might not be having. And so, if you know that about yourself, you've got to back off and take whatever measures you can to regulate.
Excellent. Okay, next question. Is it better to separate our drinking and eating? I find having a small 10-minute window between drinking and eating beneficial. What are your thoughts?
It can. I think it depends a lot on the temperature, right? When it's really, really hot out, I tend to find that at a 4% carbohydrate solution, 4 grams per 100 mils, or about 100 calories in a small bottle, that you can mostly drink your calories, and you don't have to worry about the eating so much. Physically, I think it just depends on the person, right? A lot of people feel that if they're eating and drinking at the same time, they're overloading their stomach. They can feel some of that distension. It can be uncomfortable. I don't think that it really matters in terms of an optimum or an optimal type of scenario. It really depends on the individual, and so I basically just encourage people to experiment. One thing is clear, though, is that you need to get that fluid in very consistently, and you need to get those calories in very consistently, especially if it's going to be a very, very long day. That's going to be very, very hard. And if it works for you that you're offsetting your drinking and your eating, but you're doing it on a regular basis, I think that's just fine. For the most part, what I tend to find is that guys will drink a little bit, then they'll have a small bite, then they'll drink a little more to help wash it down, and that tends to be more of the norm.
Excellent. So maybe an add-on to the last two questions. How does duration of the exercise impact the recommendations you just provided? I've heard that less than 1 hour only requires water, not sports drink. Is that true? And then second part, does the temperature impact this answer?
Yes and yes. I think that duration really, really does matter. Temperature really does matter. It's all about sweat rate, right? And I think that for the most part, most people exercising for an hour don't really need a sports drink, especially if they're not having any negative signs or symptoms associated with that 1 hour bout. The real thing to do is to measure your body weight pre and post exercise. And if you're exercising really hard, even in the heat, and you're not losing more than 3-4% of your body weight, then drinking water is probably just fine. You'll be diluting out the sodium in your bloodstream, but not so much that you're going to become hyponatremic or have any kind of ill consequences. What really happens, or what you need to really pay attention to, is these very long duration activities in the heat where replacing sodium becomes super important. So yeah, temperature and duration really matter. The shorter duration, the more you can get away drinking just water. The higher the temperature, the more you've got to pay attention to, not only your fluid intake, but how much sodium you might be needing.
Excellent. Okay, new question, and there'll only be 2 or 3 more. I've kind of got the last ones narrowed down. Does it benefit to use alkaline water in Scratch Labs hydration mix?
People talk a lot about the alkalinity of water affecting our body chemistry, etc. I don't tend to think that it matters, and the reason is that our stomach is a very, very acidic environment, and because it's such an acidic environment, we have a mechanism of releasing bicarb into the small intestine or at the pyloric sphincter to try to neutralize the acidity and to bring this back up to a normal acid base. If you do the math and you look at the effect of the volume of fluid we need during exercise, if we were to change that pH, I don't think that it would have a very significant effect on the net pH of our body, especially during exercise. So yeah, I don't think that the alkalinity matters all that much. We try to keep our drink mix, on the more alkaline side, but it is still pretty acidic because of the fruit and the fruit acid that we use in it for taste. What we have found is that when we bring our drink to a more alkaline state, either the same pH as water or above the pH of water, people just won't drink the solution. They won't drink it because it ends up making it taste kind of putrid. It tastes like you're drinking sweat. We've made these solutions in the past to see how they work, and people end up just spitting them out. So, my sense of it is better to take on the fluid than to not want to take on the fluid.
Excellent answer. Okay, a simple one on hydration here, going a little old school. What do you think of the Armstrong urine color chart as a way to assess hydration status?
Yeah, I think that it's very similar to, these specific gravity tests. So, the specific gravity of urine measures essentially how concentrated that urine is. That's one way that you can assess somebody's hydration status, and color definitely reflects that concentration. And so if you've got, a very orange or yellow or highly colored urine, it's definitely going to be on the concentrated side, and that's an indication that you might want to drink more. It's fairly old school, but I think it works in context. And that context is to also ask yourself, well, how much have you been drinking that day? How do you feel? Do you have a headache? Do you have any of the signs and symptoms associated with dehydration or heat stress? And if all of those other boxes tick off as well, and you have this highly concentrated urine, then I think it's safe to say that you're probably dehydrated.
Excellent answer. All right, the last question of the night. For post-workout hydration and fueling, is chocolate milk a legitimate refueling strategy? It seems simple, as it has both carbs and protein our body needs post-workout. Is there something you would suggest that is as simple or as easy, or is chocolate milk good?
Yeah, I think it's good. It works. And I think that there are really only three things that you need to worry about in terms of a recovery drink for endurance performance. Those three things are simple sugar, maybe a little bit of protein, and caffeine, as well as, well, one last factor, replacing fluid and sodium. Um, when we talk about recovery or recovery drink for endurance performance, we're really talking about how we can maximize the resynthesis of muscle glycogen, right? How can we replenish all of the burnt carbohydrate back in our muscle in a very short period of time? If you're in a stage race and you need to exercise the next day within 18 hours, this becomes really, really important. If you're not exercising the next day, or you don't really have a hard event the next day, it becomes less of an issue, and you can just be a normal person and go out to dinner after your workout, or go have a normal lunch and not worry about it so much. That being said, what does enhance the resynthesis of glycogen is, one, the timing of food. So making sure that you get it immediately after exercise when your muscles are still super sensitive to insulin, and when that insulin will help to bring that simple sugar back to the muscles that were used during exercise. In that case, straight up sugar works the best. In the tour, we were making guys a 10% solution, sugar solution, and it's essentially the same sweetness as you might find in a soda. Not great if you're sitting on your butt, but really great if you just finished a stage in the Tour de France. The second thing is maybe just a little bit of protein, right? That might help with the actual muscle recovery and some of the damage from the exercise. It may or may not, depending upon the literature you read, enhance glycogen synthesis, but it maybe can help with increasing your amino acid pool for the help of tissue repair. Caffeine has been shown in pretty high doses to increase glycogen resynthesis, but then you have the problem of not being able to sleep at night if you're very sensitive to caffeine. Finally, certain types of vinegars, acetic acid, have been shown to improve glycogen resynthesis as well. So, maybe the perfect post-exercise recovery drink is some sort of Starbucks, coffee frappuccino thing, in addition to chocolate milk. Or maybe it's a big bowl of rice with some scrambled eggs and a little bit of rice vinegar and salt. Who knows? Could also be a liter of Coke.
Excellent answers. I can only add to myself, in working with athletes, and what we see is we get very locked into the desire for a single solution for things. And that single solution desire is often it's the search for the absolute best, for the magic truth. And, to me, one of the constant learning lessons, and, it was early here in Dr. Lim's presentation, you're an N of one. I've seen this over thousands of athletes where we try to apply one set of rules to the entire universe, or we try to find the one secret solution. The most important thing every athlete should do when it comes to hydration and nutrition is, and I can only say this from a coaching sense, not from a physiology sense, even though I think it will ring true, you need to find the protocol that works for you. And that's a series of, you are an N of one. It's you. It's how your body, the physiological response is always somewhat unique. How somebody's going to respond to a recovery drink versus someone else might not exactly be the same. You need to find what works for you as an endurance athlete, or as a coach. I see a lot of coaches on here, for your athlete, and make it a repeatable venue. If you have a training protocol, you go through training plans, and we do that. But if you don't have, as the 3 stools showed, if you don't have a hydration and nutrition protocol, and if you don't have a recovery protocol, just to add the 3rd stool, that's a mistake. And that's where you're leaving things on the table. So people over-focus on one magic solution. The magic solution is finding out how you react to each one of those legs so you can well balance your stool. Develop that into a protocol that works for you, and I tend to find you find the most success. Alan, that was a spectacular webinar. What great information. Thank you so much, and thank you, Scratch Labs, for doing all the great things that you do for us. We're going to post the recording for those that missed it or I already saw a couple questions. You missed half. We'll post it and link everybody that was signed up back into it. Alan, do you have any closing thoughts or anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I just really echo your statements that we're all our own experiment, and that this, is a process, and that science is a method for, solving our own problems. It's important sometimes, though, to distinguish between the problems that we can actually solve and the paradoxes that we end up just needing to manage. And that's a lot about life and a lot about performance, right? They go hand in hand. But ultimately, if you do have a system, as you mentioned, you can start to give yourself feedback, and you can start to self-correct. And once you find what works for you, do that. There are a lot of trends that happen in sport. There are a lot of trends in life in general, and ultimately, everyone is responsible for making their own choices. At the end of the day, I tend to find that common sense and your own self-intuition end up working the best. And so rely on that feel, trust yourself, and I think that you'll find yourself performing better than ever.
Excellent. Well, thank you everybody for attending. We'll send out a post real soon. Thanks again and have a great night. Bye, everyone.